In the early years of World War II, before the world fully grasped the magnitude of what was unfolding, there was a sense of peace that lingered, fragile yet palpable, in the hearts of those who had not yet been touched by the violence of war. For some, this was a time of routine, a morning cup of coffee, a walk through the cobbled streets of a city untouched by the ravages of conflict, a simple existence in a world that felt, for a moment, immune to the forces that were sweeping across Europe. But beneath the calm surface of daily life, there was a creeping anxiety, a subtle awareness that something was amiss, a storm gathering on the horizon. It was a time when innocence and ignorance were still at odds with the looming reality of occupation, when people could not yet fathom the extent to which their lives would soon be turned upside down. She lived in one of the many cities that found itself in the path of war's relentless march. The city was a blend of old-world charm and modern sophistication, with narrow alleys that echoed the footsteps of generations, and wide boulevards lined with trees where children played and families gathered in the evenings. Life here was orderly, predictable. The sounds of everyday life filled the air, the clink of china as breakfast was served, the chatter of neighbors gossiping over their fences, the distant hum of carriages and streetcars carrying people from one part of the city to another. But these small joys were beginning to fade, gradually replaced by a pervasive sense of unease, a collective consciousness that something had changed. The war, though still distant, had begun to exert its influence. She had grown up in this city, in a home filled with the warmth of a loving family, where stories were passed down through generations, and where every corner seemed to hold a memory of days gone by. But the peace she had known in her youth was slipping away, and she could feel the world shifting beneath her feet. News of the war seemed distant at first, like a storm at sea that might never reach shore. Yet the news slowly grew darker, and whispers of occupation began to spread through the streets. The once vibrant shops that lined the boulevards began to close, and a sense of stillness crept into the air. It was as though the city, once alive with the pulse of life, had started to fall into a deep, uneasy sleep. But the reality was clear: war was coming, and the world would never be the same again. Her family had always lived in a place of relative safety, hidden behind the walls of their modest home. They were not particularly wealthy, nor were they influential in the broader political landscape, but they had always felt secure in their way of life. But now, that sense of security was slipping away. Her father, who had always been the pillar of the household, had begun to show signs of strain. The weight of the war hung heavy on his shoulders, and he spoke less and less of the future. Her mother, too, was quieter, her eyes filled with the worry of a mother who could not protect her children from the unknown. The children, once carefree and full of joy, now sensed the change in the air. They no longer played in the streets with the same abandon. Their laughter, though still present, was tinged with a nervous uncertainty, as though they, too, could feel the storm coming. As the months passed, the signs of occupation became more pronounced. The streets that had once been filled with bustling crowds now seemed quieter, as if the very city was holding its breath. The first soldiers arrived, their presence a sharp contrast to the serene backdrop of the city. They moved with the assuredness of those who believed they had the right to impose their will on others. Their uniforms were stark against the cobblestone streets, their boots echoing with a heaviness that sent a chill through the hearts of those who witnessed them. At first, they were just a few, strangers in the streets, standing guard in places where there had once been life. But soon, their numbers grew, and the city that had once been a haven of normalcy was gradually transformed into an occupied territory. For her, the shift was palpable. The air itself seemed to change, heavy with the knowledge that her life, her very existence, was now at the mercy of forces beyond her control. Every step she took outside the house felt like a risk. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting from side to side, as if the very act of living in this new reality could lead to her undoing. The streets, once filled with familiar faces, were now populated with soldiers who looked at her and everyone else with a mixture of indifference and suspicion. It was as if the city, which had once been a place of belonging, had become a foreign land, where the rules were different, and where survival meant adapting to a new and terrifying world. The fear that took root in her heart was not just the fear of what might happen, but the fear of what already had. The slow erosion of normality, the The creeping encroachment of the soldiers into everyday life had begun to unravel everything she knew. She could no longer take comfort in the rituals that once brought her peace, waking to the smell of her mother's cooking, hearing the birds outside the window, the sound of church bells in the distance. These small things, which once anchored her to a sense of stability, were now tinged with an unspoken dread. The reality of occupation was no longer a distant possibility. It had arrived, and it was not something that could be easily ignored or avoided. As the weeks wore on, the city began to take on an almost surreal quality. There was no single event, no dramatic moment that marked the transition from normal life to the chaos that would soon follow. Instead, it was a gradual transformation, one that occurred in the spaces between moments, in the quiet shifts of the everyday. The shops were no longer just closed, they were now requisitioned by the occupiers, their goods stripped away and sent to serve a foreign power. The streets that had once been filled with laughter were now patrolled by armed soldiers. The people who had once exchanged smiles now exchanged only fearful glances, each of them silently acknowledging the change in their lives, but too afraid to speak of it openly. She could feel the walls closing in on her, could sense the way her world was narrowing, the horizon closing in. In her mind, she was already beginning to prepare herself for the worst. She had heard the stories of those who had been taken, of the humiliation they endured, of the horrors that awaited those who dared to resist. And in the quiet recesses of her heart, she began to imagine what her own fate might look like. She could not escape the reality that the war had already changed everything. There would be no heroic moment of resistance, no sudden twist of fate that would save her. No, she was simply another cog in the machine, another figure in the long line of casualties that the war had already claimed. But despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her, there was something else, something that she could not yet name. A strange sense of defiance, perhaps, or a stubborn streak of hope, flickered in her chest. Though she felt powerless in the face of the occupation, though the future seemed uncertain and fraught with danger, there remained within her the faintest spark that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to endure. She did not know it then, but this would be the moment that would define her, the moment when everything would change. The knock came unexpectedly, sharp and abrupt, a sudden rupture in the stillness of her home. It wasn't the soft knock of a neighbor seeking a favor or a friend arriving for a quick visit, but a cold, mechanical sound that reverberated in the quiet house. For a moment, she stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she heard the unmistakable sound of boots on the front steps. She knew immediately what it meant. The soldiers had come. The inevitable had arrived, as it had for so many others. The occupation had moved into her life, and now it was making its claim. Her father, who had been the pillar of their family, a man whose presence was synonymous with stability, looked at her with a look that could only be described as weary resignation. It was a look that said so much without words. This was the moment they had all feared, and now it had arrived. He didn't speak, not because he couldn't, but because words would not have made any difference. They all knew what was coming. There was no pleading, no bargaining with these soldiers. They were not here to reason. They were here to impose. The door opened, and there they stood, soldiers in their dark, menacing uniforms, their boots polished to a gleaming shine that seemed to reflect the oppressive power they wielded. They were strangers, foreign in both appearance and manner, their faces set in hard, emotionless lines. One of them stepped forward, his cold eyes scanning the room with the detached precision of a man who had done this countless times before. Without a word, he motioned for her to stand, and though her body felt frozen, paralyzed with fear, her legs obeyed the command. The chill of the room seemed to intensify as she realized that her life, everything she had known, was about to be torn away from her in a matter of moments. The soldiers didn't waste time with pleasantries. There were no gestures of apology, no hint of mercy in their actions. One of them stepped forward and began rifling through the house, tossing aside cherished belongings, books, photographs, and trinkets that once held meaning. Each item was discarded carelessly, as though it had no worth. Her heart twisted in her chest as she watched the disintegration of her home, her life, her memories. In that moment, it became clear that nothing in her world would ever be the same again. She tried to resist the flood of emotions that surged within her: anger, fear, helplessness, but they all seemed useless, irrelevant in the face of this overwhelming force. What was the point of resistance? What could a single person do against the might of an occupying army? It was like trying to stop a storm with bare hands. There was no way to hold back the tide, no way to change the course of events that were unfolding around her. The soldiers were here, and her fate, it seemed, had already been sealed. They moved swiftly, their actions calculated and ruthless. She was told to gather her things, though she had no idea what she could possibly take. How do you choose what to keep when everything you own suddenly feels worthless? The small comforts that once defined her life, the items she had taken for granted, now seemed absurdly insignificant in the face of what was to come. She grabbed a few things: clothes, a small bag, a scarf, but in her hands, it all felt hollow. What was the point of possessions now, when the very foundation of her world was crumbling away? Nothing mattered anymore except the cruel reality of the moment. She was being taken. The soldiers didn't ask, they simply took. She was pushed forward, the harsh grip of one of the soldiers on her arm, dragging her out of the house and into the streets. The cool air of the evening hit her skin like a slap, and for the first time, she realized how exposed she was. She had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. It was as though the very act of being taken stripped away any sense of identity she had left. She was no longer a daughter, a sister, a person. She was simply a prisoner, a body to be moved and discarded at will. The streets she had once walked with confidence now seemed foreign and threatening. The city, which had been a place of comfort, was now an alien landscape, its familiar corners twisted into something menacing. The people who passed by, their heads down, their eyes averted, seemed to acknowledge the soldiers' presence with a silent agreement, a shared understanding that resistance would only lead to further suffering. There was no help to be found here, no safety in the arms of a stranger. The city, once a sanctuary, had become a place of confinement, where every corner felt watched and every movement felt observed. The journey was not long, but it felt interminable. She was herded through the streets like cattle, surrounded by soldiers on all sides. The sounds of the city, distant conversations, the hum of traffic, the cries of children playing, felt like they belonged to another time, a time that no longer existed. It was as though the world had been reset, and she was caught in the middle of a new reality that left no room for personal will or choice. Her world had been stolen, and she could do nothing but follow, powerless against the tide. When they arrived at the facility, she could feel the weight of her new reality pressing down on her. The gates closed behind them with a heavy finality, and she knew that there would be no escape, no reprieve. She was trapped, along with so many others, in this place that was designed to break the spirit, to erase the humanity of those held within its walls. She was pushed into a small, cold room that smelled of damp stone and stale air. It was nothing like her home. There were no comforts here, no warmth or familiarity. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she could feel the chill of isolation settling into her bones. In that moment, as the door slammed shut behind her, she realized that her life as she had known it was gone. She had entered a new world, one where survival meant adapting to the will of the enemy, where every day was a fight to maintain some shred of dignity. The humiliation she had feared was now her reality. But worse than the humiliation itself was the profound sense of loss. The loss of agency, the loss of everything she had once taken for granted. She was no longer a person in control of her own life. She was a prisoner, defined only by the walls that surrounded her and the soldiers who watched over her. But even in the face of this brutal reality, there was something inside her that refused to give up. She did not know how or why, but there was a flicker of resistance that burned inside her, a tiny spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. She did not know how this would end, but she knew one thing for certain: she would not let herself be defined by the cruelty of the soldiers who held her captive. There was still some part of her that remained untouched, some part that refused to accept the humiliation, that refused to accept the despair. It was a fragile thing, but it was enough to sustain her through the dark days that lay ahead. As she stood in that cold, unwelcoming room, surrounded by the bitter reality of her situation, She understood, perhaps for the first time, the true nature of fear. It was not just the fear of what might happen, but the fear of what was already happening, of the loss of everything that had once defined her. It was the fear of being broken, of being reduced to something less than human. But in that fear, there was also something else, a resolve, a quiet determination that would carry her through the days to come. In the prison, the passage of time became almost impossible to track, the days blending into each other in a constant blur of monotony and despair. The walls, cold and unyielding, seemed to close in, offering no escape, no reprieve from the crushing reality of captivity. The once familiar rhythm of life had been replaced by the harsh, mechanical rhythms of a system that had no place for human dignity. Her body and mind, once full of energy and purpose, now felt heavy with the weight of the unknown. Every breath, every thought, felt laden with an unbearable burden, and yet there was no outlet for the grief that swelled within her. The suffering around her seemed endless, like a torrent that swept away everything in its path, leaving nothing behind but empty shells of people who had been broken by the very circumstances they found themselves in. At first, she had tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, clinging to the remnants of the life she had known before this nightmare. But with each passing day, that normalcy slipped further and further away, like sand slipping through her fingers. The routines that once governed her life, the moments of quiet reflection, the simple joys of a cup of tea, the soft murmur of her family in the evenings, now felt like distant memories, as though they had belonged to someone else. The isolation she felt was not just physical but also mental, as if her mind had been severed from the world it once knew. The days stretched out before her, endless and devoid of hope, each one indistinguishable from the last. The physical environment was a constant reminder of her captivity. The walls of the prison were drab, gray stone, cold to the touch and barren of any decoration. The floor beneath her feet was made of rough, uneven concrete, its surface scarred and chipped from years of wear. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay, a smell that seemed to seep into her very being, leaving an indelible mark on her soul. The room where she was confined was small, barely enough space to move around, and the only light came from a single, small window high on the wall, its bars casting long shadows across the floor. Through that window, she could see nothing but the sky, and even that seemed distant and unreachable, a cruel reminder of a world she could no longer touch. The food, when it came, was sparse and barely edible. There was no warmth in it, no comfort, no satisfaction. The guards brought it to her without a word, leaving it on the cold stone floor before walking away, their footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no conversation, no acknowledgement of her presence. She had become invisible to them, just another nameless, faceless prisoner in a sea of humanity that had been forgotten by the world. She ate what little was offered, not because it nourished her body but because it was the only thing that kept her from fading completely into the darkness of her own mind. Food had become a necessity, not a comfort. The sounds of the prison were almost as oppressive as the silence. The faint murmur of voices, the clatter of chains, the occasional cry of someone in pain, all of it merged into a constant, low hum that filled the air, a reminder that she was not alone in her suffering. There were others here, other women, their faces a blur of fear and hopelessness. Some were older, others younger, but all of them shared the same vacant look in their eyes, the same hollow expression that came from having endured too much, for too long. Some had lost their will to live, while others had resigned themselves to their fate, accepting that there was no escape, no future beyond the walls that held them prisoner. They spoke little, if at all, and when they did, their words were heavy with the weight of despair, each syllable a burden that seemed too great to bear. Despite the crushing isolation, there were moments when the walls seemed to close in even tighter, moments when the realization of her helplessness became almost too much to bear. She would lie on the cold floor, staring up at the low ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of everything she had lost. The image of her home, her family, the life she had known before the war, these memories would surface like fleeting ghosts, only to be swallowed up by the darkness once again. She had no way of knowing whether they were alive or dead, whether she would ever see them again. The uncertainty gnawed at her, a constant ache in her chest that never went away. In the quietest moments, when the noise of the prison seemed to fade into the background, she would close her eyes and remember. She would remember the feel of the sun on her face, the sound of birds singing in the trees, the laughter of children playing in the streets. These memories, once so vivid, now felt like they belonged to someone else, someone from a different life. But even as she tried to hold on to them, they began to slip away, fading into the fog of her current reality. The more she held on, the more they seemed to dissolve, as though they were being erased from her mind, replaced by the grim reality of the present. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of loss, there was still something within her that refused to let go of those memories. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps it was simply the will to survive, but whatever it was, it kept her from surrendering entirely to the despair that threatened to consume her. There were moments, too, when the guards would come for her, dragging her from her cell for some unknown purpose. She would be led through the dark, narrow hallways of the prison, the clink of her chains echoing off the walls. The guards were silent, their eyes cold and unfeeling. She would be forced into a room, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, and made to wait in the oppressive silence that hung over the place. The waiting was the worst part, the anticipation of whatever was to come next. What would they do to her? What would they take from her this time? Every moment of waiting felt like an eternity, each breath heavier than the last, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. The worst of it, though, was the silence. The long, unbearable silence that stretched on for days, sometimes weeks, with no word, no sign of anything beyond the prison walls. She was left alone with her thoughts, her fears, her doubts. It was in these moments that the true horror of her captivity became clear, not just the physical suffering, but the emotional and psychological toll it was taking on her. She had been stripped of everything, her family, her home, her identity, and now, it seemed, they were trying to strip her of her very will to live. They wanted her to break, to accept her fate without resistance, to become nothing more than a shadow of who she had once been. But despite the crushing weight of it all, she refused to give in. In the darkest corners of her mind, she began to question what it meant to be human. Was it the things she had once held dear, her family, her home, her simple joys? Or was it something deeper, something that could not be taken away by walls or chains? Even as the days dragged on and the suffering continued, she found herself clinging to the belief that there was still something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to. It was a small spark, a flicker of light in the darkness, but it was enough to keep her going, enough to keep her from succumbing to the despair that surrounded her. Despite everything, she still believed that she could survive this. She had to. The first time she saw him, it was nothing more than a passing glimpse. He was a figure in the distance, a British officer walking briskly through the gates of the camp with an air of authority that immediately set him apart from the others. The guards, who usually moved with a cold, indifferent precision, seemed to acknowledge him with a degree of respect that was unfamiliar. He didn't appear as the typical soldier, not like the men who had brought her here, who had stripped away her dignity with every harsh word and every cruel glance. This man moved differently, with a purpose that seemed to transcend the ordinary, as if he was a part of something bigger than himself. He was an enigma, a foreign presence that, in the midst of the bleakness that surrounded her, felt like a breath of something else, something unexpected, something human. At first, she had no idea what to make of him. He wasn't like the others. He didn't have the same menacing air about him. The others, the occupying forces, had always been a constant reminder of her powerlessness. But this officer was different. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no sneer on his lips. Instead, his expression was serious, focused, as though he was here on some higher mission. And in the midst of the horror of the camp, his presence felt like a flicker of light in the darkness, a spark of something that had been lost. It was a small thing, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of her suffering, but it was enough to make her wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for something different. Days passed, and she would see him occasionally, walking through the camp with the same air of purpose, surrounded by a small group of men who seemed to follow him rather than lead. There was no conversation between them, at least not one she could hear, but there was an unspoken respect in the way the others behaved around him. It was as if they, too, recognized that he was not like the rest. There were no harsh commands, no shouted orders. Instead, he moved with a quiet authority that seemed to command respect without ever demanding it. He would occasionally stop to speak to the prisoners, his tone soft and measured, his eyes never losing their focus. He didn't speak to her directly, not at first, but in his presence, something shifted in the air. It was as though the very atmosphere of the camp changed, if only for a moment. She didn't know what to make of him at first. She had been so broken by the constant mistreatment, so stripped of her identity by the guards who controlled every aspect of her life, that the idea of kindness or compassion felt like a distant memory. She had come to accept the harsh reality of her situation, to believe that there was no escape from the cruelty that surrounded her. But in his presence, something began to stir inside her. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it was there, a glimmer of hope, a fragile thought that perhaps things didn't have to be this way. One day, as she stood in line for food, she saw him approach. This time, he wasn't just passing through the camp. He was heading directly toward her, his eyes scanning the rows of prisoners. The guards didn't notice him at first, distracted by their own routines. But she saw him. She couldn't look away. There was something in the way he moved, in the way his gaze lingered on the faces of those around him, that made her heart race. She knew in that moment that something was happening, something she couldn't explain. When he reached her, he stopped. His gaze softened, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She could see something in his expression, something that she had not seen in the eyes of the other soldiers: empathy. It was a look that carried no judgment, no sense of superiority. It was simply an acknowledgement, a recognition of her humanity, and in that single, fleeting moment, it shattered the cold shell of indifference she had built around herself. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She felt as though her voice had been stolen, and she was reduced to a silent observer in her own life. He nodded briefly, as though confirming something to himself, and then moved on, continuing his inspection of the camp. But in the moments that followed, she could feel the weight of that brief interaction lingering in the air. It was as though, for just a second, the walls of the prison had cracked, and a tiny sliver of light had slipped through. The presence of this officer, this stranger, had made her realize that there was still some shred of decency left in the world. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that perhaps there was hope for something more than just survival. The days that followed brought more glimpses of him. He didn't come every day, but when he did, there was always a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The guards, who had once seemed so sure of their control, now seemed more cautious, more aware of their actions. It was as though they, too, recognized that this man was different, that he did not operate under the same rules as they did. His presence was a quiet challenge to the cruelty that had defined the camp, a reminder that there was another way to be, one that was grounded in respect for the people who were trapped here, people who had been stripped of their dignity but who were still, in the core of their beings, human. One afternoon, as she was sitting in the cold, stone room they had assigned to her, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. At first, she thought it was just another guard coming to deliver orders or instructions, but then she heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Her heart quickened as she turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that whatever was happening, it was different. The door to her room opened, and there he stood, the British officer, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before landing on her. This time he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, with a softness that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the surroundings. He asked her name, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. The question seemed so simple, yet in that moment, it carried with it the weight of everything that had happened to her since her arrival in this place. She could hardly remember who she was anymore, and the thought of answering, of reclaiming her identity, felt overwhelming. But he waited, patiently, and finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. His response was brief but kind, and then, without another word, he turned to leave. But before he stepped out, he paused and looked back at her. It was a look that spoke volumes, one that carried a promise, even if unspoken. It was a promise that she wasn't invisible, that she wasn't just another number, another casualty of war. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone had seen her, really seen her, and in that act, something deep inside her stirred. In the days that followed, this officer became a fixture in the camp, not as a tyrant or a tool of oppression, but as a quiet presence of decency in the midst of a world gone mad. He would come and go, moving through the camp with the same calm purpose, his interactions with the prisoners always respectful, always human. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a show of resistance or defiance, but something far more subtle, far more powerful. He reminded them, in the simplest of ways, that there was still goodness in the world, still a chance for something better, even in the darkest of times. Her hope, fragile as it was, began to grow. The camp, which had once felt like a tomb, now seemed a little less oppressive. Perhaps it was the way the officer treated them, with a dignity that was foreign to the brutal system that held them captive, or perhaps it was the quiet defiance that his mere presence instilled in her. But in that small act of decency, she began to believe, however cautiously, that the world was not entirely lost. That even in the worst of circumstances, there could be a flicker of light. It was a small thing, but in a place where hope was in such short supply, it was everything. In the days that followed, the presence of the British officer began to have a subtle, but undeniable, effect on the camp. His mere existence in the midst of the brutality of the occupation was a quiet act of defiance, a silent rejection of the cruelty that had been ingrained into the very fabric of the camp's operation. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. It wasn't as if the world suddenly shifted on its axis, or that the prisoners were suddenly liberated from their suffering. But there was something about his presence that made the air feel different. It wasn't the loud, rebellious kind of change, the kind that would spark revolutions. It was more like a quiet, steady drip of water, wearing down the hardest stone, slowly altering the landscape of the camp in ways that were difficult to quantify. For her, it was the smallest of things that stood out. She noticed how, on the rare occasions when the officer passed by, the guards would step aside, almost unconsciously. Their faces, typically stone-cold and filled with disdain, would soften, if only for a moment. They wouldn't look him in the eye. No, they didn't dare, but there was a difference in their behavior. There was a hesitance in the way they moved, as if they were aware of the power he carried with him. It was subtle, like the shifting of the wind, but it was there. And the effect was contagious. The prisoners, though still shackled by their own sense of fear and despair, began to take note. The hardened expressions on their faces softened, just slightly, as though they, too, had been reminded that there was still goodness in the world, even if it was buried deep beneath layers of oppression. The officer's actions, though few and far between, were like a faint pulse of life in a place that had grown numb. He would occasionally stop to speak with the prisoners, asking their names, inquiring about their well-being, not as a soldier interrogating an enemy, but as a human being concerned for another. The words were simple, sometimes nothing more than a few sentences exchanged, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the prisoners were treated as people, not as cattle or tools of war. And that small act, that acknowledgement of their humanity, was enough to spark a shift in the collective mood of the camp. There were whispers in the corners, quiet conversations held under breath, where the prisoners exchanged stories about the officer. Some had seen him stop by the barracks to offer a few words of encouragement, while others recalled a moment when he had prevented a guard from taking a prisoner away for a punishment that would have surely been fatal. His actions were not revolutionary, not enough to spark a rebellion, but they were enough to make the prisoners believe that they were not completely forgotten. They were not entirely invisible. And that realization, that recognition of their worth, had a profound impact on the collective spirit of the camp. As time passed, more of the prisoners began to hold onto that fragile thread of hope, however tenuous it might have been.